All right, so part three of John Locke, and just to wrap up really with a few more points. So I've hinted at the balance of powers, the separation of powers, right? And that's really a third crucial element for the Constitution of the American Republic, and a third, I mean, in addition to private property, number one, and to government by consent, right? Less class, less video. We talked about these other two, property and consent, and now I want to talk about um, balance of powers, and the idea of limited constitutional government. Now, um, what Locke argued was essentially that there is a primacy of the legislative over the executive, but there is a balance between them, right? So I think it's useful to contrast with Hobbes, because Hobbes thought of the primacy of the executive, right? Um, and more than that, I mean, the Leviathan, right? The authoritarian central power legislates in Hobbes, right? So the executive it's not that the executive has a primacy over the legislative in Hobbes, but the executive is the legislative, right? It's the king that creates whatever laws the king wants, right? So they have complete control over it. Um, and the purpose of this authoritarian figure of the government, which in this case is Leviathan himself and Hobbes, right? But you can just think about it as the prince of Machiavelli, or as a king, or as a dictator in modern times. The purpose of having someone like that. So Hobbes would still see a purpose in having, say, Kim Jong Un in North Korea, right? He would say he's still, it's fine. Kim Jong Un is fine. Hobbes would argue. I mean, back then, right? That notion of having a tyrant wouldn't be a problem, because Hobbes would say the purpose of government is essentially to um, avoid human beings from killing one another. We're a wolf to one another, right? That's the central idea there in Hobbes. So it would have been complete chaos if it weren't for the tyrant or the central authority of government, right? That creates laws, and and then there's police force and there's the prison system, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of law and order, as I mentioned. Um, but Locke is much more demanding, right? So to him, the purposes of government is not that, right? It's not that of Hobbes, but it is to uh, avoid precisely such systems, right? Such tyrannical states. And he argues, Locke, that we didn't enter the social compact, that is, the social contract, to be devoured by lions. When he says that, he's explicitly referring to Hobbes, of course, right? Because we've seen that before. Homo homini lupus, that idea that man is a wolf to another man, right? We're wolves to one another. A man to another man is a wolf. So this idea of lions here, that we're all animals ready to devour each other. Um, Locke is saying, no, that's not it, right? We're not just that goal of Hobbes, right? To just avoid being devoured by lions. That's petty, right? We want more than that. That's not the reason why we form society, just so we are not devoured by lions, right? By each other. We want more. We want more than that, right? So not to escape chaos um, and I mean, Locke is arguing, right, contra Hobbes, that the social contract was formed not to escape chaos and to guarantee order, but it was created, this social contract, to escape authoritarianism and to guarantee not order, but liberty and private property, right? Remember what we talked about last time. Okay. Um, okay, so there is a primacy of the legislative over the executive, right? That's completely different from Hobbes, as I just argued. I can see on section 153 where Hobbes, there's this quotation here. The executive power is subordinate to the legislator. Um, but the executive power also is important at times, especially at extreme times. So at 166, he says, such godlike princes, referring to, say, the Leviathan, for example, right? I just said, as I just mentioned, they had some title to arbitrary power. So that means that, well, indeed, right, they should be kept under check, all right? So much so that the legislative is more important than the executive, but they do have some title to arbitrary power at times, right? Well, I'll give you one example, and that's an example from our constitution, okay, from our current constitution. So this is not a quote from um, the book we're reading, but from the constitution. And it's about habeas corpus, which is a fundamental right, but the privilege of habeas corpus can be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion. Okay, if the public safety requires it, that's in the Constitution. So there, although the laws are more important, right? Legislative is more important than the executive. There are situations. So, say if the United States is being invaded by another country or whatever, any countries in war, etc., then the Constitution argues that for the sake of public safety, there might be situations where privilege of habeas corpus will be suspended. In case you don't know what that is, there's a definition here. So it's a recourse where a report can be made to court in events of unlawful detention or imprisonment, requesting that the court order the person's custodian to bring the prisoner to court to determine whether their detention is lawful, right? Because basically the idea is, what if a country, say there's a, say that you didn't do anything wrong, right? But for some reason, someone wants to imprison you, although you didn't do anything wrong. Well, the person could put you, theoretically, right, could imprison you temporarily, and arguing that, well, sooner or later you'll have due trial, and that could eventually never happen, right? In theory. So that's what habeas corpus is supposed to protect. It's to protect your right to be trialed with due process, and that the state cannot, simply put you behind bars and let you wait there for an indefinite period, right? For a small period that could happen until you're trialed, but not indefinitely, right? That's what it means in Latin. Habeas corpus in Latin means to have the body, more or less, like, let me see the corpus, because it's that situation. Let's say the Roman Empire, and fighting against whatever, and there's a prisoner of war, etc. And the person goes there and says, habeas corpus is, let me see the person, right? So you can prove me that you didn't kill it or whatever. So that's the idea, more or less. I mean, originally that's where it comes from, but basically the idea is that, right? Yeah. So that you must go through the procedures, right? Indeed, you cannot be um, put in prison and then not be trialed, and according to um, legislation. So Locke makes a similar argument in terms of, in extreme times, it is true that the executive, okay, can trump the legislative, but typically it's the other way around. There should be subordination, and that's one thing he's concerned about, right? What are those mechanisms that guarantee that two things happen: that the executive doesn't degenerate into tyranny? That's one of the things he's worried about, right? That didn't worry Hobbes, but that does worry Locke, right? That's the first point I made here in this video. Um, and the second thing is that the legislative doesn't degenerate into powerlessness, right? Because if you say that, and he is saying that the legislative um, has some authority, not complete authority, but some authority over the executive. Um, just coming back here, point one, right? The primacy of legislative over executive. That was point one, right? When you say this, there's the danger of, well, okay, but how do we enforce the laws, right? We need to enforce the laws, isn't it? So you see, when you have extreme times in the US, you could lose a right that is so important, right? Um, Simply because there are things that are considered more important at that point, right? Is the for the safety of everyone. So there are points where either the executive has to take over like this, or the executive has to enforce, and the judiciary as well, right? As you know, they have to cooperate, right? So he's worried about this, right? How do we guarantee? Because I mean, laws, right? Constitution, that's all great, but I mean, those are just written words, isn't it? If you don't have mechanisms to guarantee it, if you don't have the police to enforce laws, then they are powerless, isn't it? So these are the things he's worried about. How do you reach this balance between the powers, right? That sort of golden mean is the what Locke is thinking about. And his answer to this question in particular, right? How do we guarantee that the executive doesn't degenerate into tyranny? And he's going to argue essentially that we have the right to appeal to heaven. That's the quote on section 168 of the book. But when he says appeal to heaven, what he actually is saying, right? And I mean, he's more explicit about it. If you read the book, there's no um question about it, but that his argument there is that people have the right to rebel, that people have the right to appeal to arms, right? By appeal to heaven, he's essentially saying, because at that point in the, you probably read by this point, but if not, you will read. And when you read that quote there, appeal to heaven, you'll remember he's basically saying at that point, well, what can people do at that point if this starts to happen? So if there is a tendency of the executive, say the prince or the president of a country, if he starts becoming too authoritarian, so killing people, taking people's rights away. So if it starts going in that direction, um uh Locke is saying, what can you do? Just appeal to heaven, and basically saying, that you can appeal to arms, right? That people have the power to overthrow either a president or either a president or a prince, a king, whatever it is, right? The Leviathan himself, whatever it is. And then again, I mentioned this, right? That's partially why it was so appealing. So you have this mechanism to prevent the executive from becoming too large, right? Locke will argue, well, we can rest assured that the laws won't become completely um, under the control of the tyrant, because people would simply, if it's a president, vote for a new president, but they can rebel if not, right? And that was at the core of the formation of the US. And so I'm going to suggest here a number of different ways you could read Locke, and I think we've been talking about this. This idea of rebel and power to the people and the right to arms, right? That you should, which was essentially what happened in the U.S., right? Rebelling against England and forming their own country. How do we should we read Locke in terms of that, right? And all his taciturnity. Does that mean that he's a sort of a revolutionary, like a cautious one, with the idea of arms and revolution and Um, because we've also argued, on the other hand, that he's a classic libertarian, possibly, right? Private property, he was so important in the establishment of that. Life, liberty, and private property becomes, right, the central tenets of American identity, etc., right? So his has an importance like that as well. So can we put these two together and we are provocatively calling it the Che Guevara of capitalism? But that's just to argue, right? That like Che Guevara, or like when we think of communist, socialist revolutions, when we think of people rebelling and right to arms, we typically think of someone like Che Guevara, or right. But funnily enough, right? Back then it was the opposite. It was different, right? I mean, Locke, in that context, he's basically saying we might have to rebel against the status quo, right? Now, Che Guevara would get arms to rebel against capitalism because capitalism is the status quo. But back then, when Locke is writing, capitalism was not even, didn't even exist, right? It was barely even beginning, right? Um, it hadn't begun yet. I mean, but the commercial society was starting to take shape, but very, very, right. Uh, just the seeds of it, really. So the status quo was the kings and queens, wasn't it? That was the nobles, right? The nobility. That was the status quo. So capitalism now is not associated with an idea of that, call to arms, or right, but at that point, he would be something like a Che Guevara of capitalism back then, right? If you um, put these things together, right? But what else do we want to call him? America's philosopher king, because right, at the end of the day, he formed the backbones of the American Constitution, American identity. Etc. He was so fundamental for America in so many senses that we call him America's philosopher king, at least in what concerns the political formation of the US, right? There might be several important scientists to America, of course, depending on different things you're looking at. But in terms of the formation of the country, the American independence, in terms of the founding fathers, Locke can also be called perhaps American philosopher kings, or maybe none of them, right? So maybe you want to think of your own interpretation of Locke. But yeah, I'm bringing all this up because, as I've mentioned, Locke is sometimes difficult to read, or I mean, the text is very clear. Obviously, that's not what I mean, but by difficult to read, it's very easy to read in that sense. But what is difficult in him, or not difficult, but what you could debate is whether that the religiousness of him are just lip service, and he's just trying to ground his analysis more on a naturalistic account, or if he does things that are rights, are sacred, and they come directly from the divine, etc. Right? Those aspects are hard to read, and you don't know exactly. And you can see that he's carefully threading, these different things at a time where there was a lot of political turmoil in England. Remember 1640 and then 1688, the kings being um, killed, and then the Glorious Revolution, etc. But you can, of course, explore these issues on your essay. Of course, I've mentioned this before, but um, nice way to that can be very fun also for you to write is you just take as a starting point Glaucon and his idea of the social contract, so the mean between two things. If you look at these figures here, they're from based on Aristotle, actually. I'm just going to zoom here because of this point I'm making. So Aristotle has this idea of the golden mean, that virtue is always reaching a midpoint between two things, right? So courage is somewhere between cowardice and rashness, right? If you have too much courage, that's dangerous, right? Too much courage, maybe you crash your car and you die, right? And too little courage is you're a coward and you don't accomplish anything, right? Or wit, if you're never crack a joke and you're always too serious, you're going to be a bit boring. But if you do it too much, you're going to be called a buffoon, right? So being virtuous to Aristotle is this golden mean between two extremes. And I'm mentioning this because Plato has that similar idea, and Glaucon, okay, Glaucon's vision of justice, which is the most interesting one of all, the one you should focus, I'd recommend, again, I'm saying this, is this idea that you see right here. Okay, you have two extremes, he's saying, right? One extreme would be where I always get the better of you, and the other one is you always get the better of me, right? So I'm always unjust to you, or you are always unjust to me. I always take advantage, or you always take advantage. So remember what I was saying last time there. Justice is a mean between the two extremes, Locke is arguing, because one extreme would be, you're my slave, for example, and I take advantage of you every day. And the other one is I'm the opposite, right? I'm your slave. So he's saying why Glaucon is saying people do want to be mean, as Thrasymachus did argue before, but they realize that if we're always trying to take advantage of each other, on average, we're all losing. Okay, we could all win. It's a win-win. That's the point. For two people, it's a win-win situation to establish justice as these rules, social norms, right? Regulations, public institutions that guarantee that we follow those rules, the justice system that we've established, because it's better that I never take advantage of you, conditional of you never taking advantage of me, and that's what justice is, right? Then for me to 3 days a week take advantage of you, and for you to 3 days a week take advantage of me, right? Because we all lose if we do that. That's the argument that connects. And Aristotle has this idea here of virtue always being, the golden mean between two things. And Glaucon, it's the same context, right? It's ancient Greece, and it's similar to this as well. What Glaucon was saying. So you can just, start from this notion of Glaucon of what justice is. Okay, let me go back here. Okay, and then and obviously, I mentioned last time the idea of consent, and consent is very, very explicit on Crito, but consent, the idea of government by consent is also here, right? That's also Glaucon, because think about it. We're consenting to the midpoint, which would be government, right? Or justice in his case, but that's the idea, the establishment of justice and government is this midpoint between I do something bad to you or you do something bad to me, right? And we are consenting to this, right? Because people realize when Glaucon tells Socrates, I'm going to tell you the origins of justice, where it comes from, etc., right? He's saying as if it were an evolutionary thing, right? Over time, over thousands of years, groups of people, they found out that by establishing those rules, by respecting the rules, right? Um, by creating a concept of justice, having a justice system, and in primitive societies, that could be a totem, like a statue, right, of some whatever god they worship. But there's several different, before we had constitutions, we had different notions of that. We had religion, establishing what was just, right, to some extent, what the rules are, what is and isn't fair, and establishing penalties, etc. So people figured out, okay, according to Glaucon, that justice, establishing this middle point, is better. And so people are consenting to it, right? He's not using that language of consent, but implicitly, people are all agreeing, okay? They're consenting to the government to the extent that they are signing that social contract, as it were, right? And so they're consenting to this government. They understand that it's for their own better, to have that government. And so from here, you can, simply go directly from this Glaucon's idea of consent directly to Locke and discuss, a bit about the formation of the US, how he's so present in the US Constitution and central ideas of American society, etc., which makes for an interesting, fun text to write, and also it's completely related to what we've talked about so far. So that's definitely one option, right? Okay, so now to close, I just want to show you a last example of social contract theory. But one argument against him provided by Rawls is that this idea of labor and private property being so central, John Rawls criticized Locke to some extent and proposes a different way of approaching the social contract by arguing that it depends a lot depends a lot on luck as well. Okay, so John Rawls will be an advocate of equality of opportunity and of the welfare state of the state providing opportunities. So he's basically going to say, it's not just private property and life and liberty, right? Those things are fine, but we need more than that. We also need a guarantee that people have equal opportunities because so much in life is determined by where you were born and random factors that, and so I just want to point this out because John Rawls is the most important political philosopher of the United States in the 20th century. Not my opinion, that's a general opinion, right? I mean, most people would agree with that. So this is not this is not this is just a just look at the number of citations that he received, for example, compared to other political scientists. Go to Google Scholar and write John Rawls' name, this book in particular, and see the number of citations and compare to other books that you may consider important. And so I'm mentioning to contrast with Locke. Okay, in other words, there are of course several political philosophers and political scientists that will have different views on the state. And of course, these views depend on how they view the individual, right? Depending on how you view the individual, you have different policy recommendations, of course, right? And John Rawls, just to explain briefly his idea. So he says, imagine that you are in an original position and you have to go through this veil of ignorance. Okay, so you don't know who you are anymore in this original position. Okay, you're just an amorphous person, not a man, not a woman, not young, not anything. You're just a. Imagine you could born again. It's something like that. It's a thought experiment, of course, an exercise. So Rawls is saying if you were to born again and go through a veil and you're going to end up in a society, okay, that's the society here on the right hand side. Here's just another representation of the same thing. And you don't know which person you're going to be. So you can be a man, a woman, you can be tall, you can have physical problems, right? You can have all sorts of conditions. You can be super smart, super not smart. Let's not be, okay. Let's not be mean, I guess, and use adjectives to diminish people. So you can have any sorts of characteristic. You could be American, you could be Latin, right? You can be Asian, African, anything. You don't know. Okay, so Rawls is arguing that one way to approach the role of government is to imagine this original position where you're completely ignorant, and then you go through this veil of ignorance, through this portal, and you end up in a different society where you could be anyone. Okay, and then he argues we should the idea of so first of all that this idea of the original position is equivalent to the state of nature, right? Is that original place where you start from, which is what Locke is doing as well. Okay, and the social contract here would be what kind of society would we design if we were to go through this situation, right? Because listen, now that if you're white, right, maybe you wouldn't be favored to certain policies that that will close the gap between white people and black people. But if you're black, maybe you would agree to such policies, right? So in this original position, you would be forced to think, do I agree with those policies without knowing that I'm white or going to be white or black, right? And then you're forced to take this position of an impartial spectator, as Adam Smith would call it, and imagine what is society ideal design without taking into consideration the role that I play in it. And Rawls is not, the conclusion of Rawls is not that we would want complete equality. For example, does that mean, therefore, that there should be no inequality in society? No, Rawls argued that there should be inequality, actually, just as long as we realize, okay, that we understand that some level of inequality is actually good for society overall, that, on average, or more people will be better off in an unequal society, which is also efficient and productive and innovative, as opposed to a society where everyone is equal. Let's say everyone receives the same income, communism, right? Because you would say, well, so communism is clearly better than capitalism here, right? Because if you don't know where you will going to end up, then you prefer an equal society, because what if you end up being the poorest person of the society, right? But that's not the case, because Rawls is arguing, well, maybe in that communist society, everyone's going to be poor. And in the capitalist society, the poorest person is even richer than the average. That's possible in theory, at least. So it doesn't mean that we don't want inequality. If we agree that inequality plays a role for this society, that plays the role of, right, guaranteeing that people work hard, and that the productivity is always increasing, that there's innovation and there's wealth creation, etc., then we would agree potentially, right? So the point is, we have to consent and sort of agree and sign this social contract, and that doesn't mean complete equality, but that does lead to not equality of outcomes, right? Not communism, but it does typically lead to equality of opportunity, this argument, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily want equality of outcomes for the very argument I just made, because that could lead to a stifling society that where nothing gets done, right? That's typically the argument against communism, whether that's true or not, right? But that's the argument, and there is an issue of, obviously, in communistic society, if there's no monetary reward for working harder, it's possible that you would still work hard anyway, right? But you would do it out of other incentives, because I don't know, because of status, for instance, because I want to be published in the best journal in the world and be cited, or I want to go to CNN or Fox News or whatever program you watch, and be interviewed. I want to be recognized. So maybe even in a communist society, people would work hard, etc. That's possible. Um, but usually that's the argument, right? And what Rawls is going to argue is, what we would not want to, like, in that original position, would be inequality of opportunities, right? We would not want to end in a society where it's very easy for someone to get everything she wants, and it's very, very hard, nearly impossible for someone else to get everything she wants, right? So, in other words, inequality may be fine, but it depends on how much inequality as well, right? What about a 1,000,000% difference between the poorest person and the richest one, right? So if you're the poorest person in society, I'm just getting the smallest person here. If you're the poorest person in society, you make $1 a year, and the richest one gets, I don't know, 1 billion or 1 trillion a year, right? If it's a ridiculous amount of, I'm exaggerating it as much as I can here. If that's the level of inequality, that's probably something we wouldn't agree with, right? Because that would lead to inequality of opportunity as well, not just outcome, right? In other words, if you're born in a society like that, and you're by a factor of 1 billion to 1 between the richest person and the poorest person, you're stuck there, right? It's going to be like a poverty trap, right? So doesn't John Rawls' conclusion here, and just to contrast with Locke, is, and when he revisits the social contract and thinks about this issue again, he's going to argue, well, we need to go beyond Locke. So not just private property, but we want to guarantee also that people have fair chances, that there's a level battling field here, right? That people have access to the same opportunities, right? And then um, there can be even big differences in outcome if these differences in outcome emerge from whoever works harder, whoever's smarter, whoever uh, has is better in making social connections, etc. Whatever you're good at, right? So if you're good at something, whatever that is, and that leads you to getting really rich, that wouldn't be a problem per se. But if you're getting really rich while someone exactly like you is really, really poor, then it's because there's not equality of opportunity, and that's the issue that Rawls would you know also want us to think about on top of property and life and liberty. All right, so that concludes for John Locke, and that's about it. Thank you again, and see you soon.